Namaste. Psychoanalysis and philosophy, profit in object loss. In our series on object loss, we continue our discussion deeper today into rare areas related to object loss. We shall take a look at healing of object loss as done by various schools and the profitable aspect of object loss. The profitable aspect of object loss sounds quite paradoxical. So let us discuss it with our psychoanalysis consultant, Mr. Himanshu Vaidya. Namaste, Mr. Vaidya.
Namaste.
Vaidya, how do various schools of psychotherapy deal with object loss?
Object relations is at the center of our psychic life. It can be object gain, it can be object maintenance, it can be object loss. But object relations are at the center of our mind. So it is inevitable that all schools of psychotherapy inevitably will have to do something or the other, have to engage with this concept of object relations. Now, the point of object maintenance and object gain are more on the positive and the normal side. The aspect of object loss is more on the pathological side. Psychotherapy therefore deals more with this aspect of object relations, which is object loss. Now, as we know by and large, pathology develops because of some traumatic event or a series of traumatic events. Events can be imaginary or real or a combination of both. So, except for a few completely genetically driven difficulties, in most cases, there is one or a series of traumatic events which result in some sort of pathology. I am not saying all traumas involve object loss, but when we say a traumatic event usually is present in 90% of cases involving pathology, then within this 90%, a substantial amount of proportion, say almost 60%, would involve some sort of object relation difficulty and in many cases object loss. I am not saying all pathology is because of object loss, but a substantial proportion of pathology involves object loss directly or indirectly. Let me name a few. For example, you can talk about personality disorders, many of anxiety issues, many of depression spectrum issues, and many of uh, sexual issues, not to mention addiction issues also. So when we go deeper, we realize that object loss is involved directly or indirectly in a much uh, larger part of the DSM pathologies. So in a majority of DSM pathologies, we see directly or indirectly object loss being involved. Now, what we call object loss, that has to be understood deeply. Object loss literally can mean actual loss of an object, that the person has actually abandoned you, never to come back, or the person has died. That would be a real objective object loss. But few object losses are of this type. They are there, but few of them. Most object losses are other kinds of object losses on that spectrum of object loss. So, the way our mind, particularly in childhood, understands the concept of object loss and responds to it, object loss refers to one, a real loss of an object because of real abandonment or death or destruction of an object. Two, it can mean infrequent appearing of the object. The object does not appear before us for a long time and we feel we have been abandoned, we have suffered an object loss, and then the object comes back. But even though the object comes back, the presence is not able to undo the complete traumatic effects of the absence. So the effects of object loss do take place even though the object reappears, and therefore we still find object loss pathology even when the object actually is not lost but is inadequately and infrequently present. The third way of object loss experience involves separation, that the object has not abandoned you, object is not dead or destroyed, but the object is separating from you because of some real life reason. And the fourth object loss can be the object loss of distance between two people even though they are together. That also is felt as an object loss, though in the physical sense, the object is with us very adequately, very frequently, but emotionally there is a distance. So any sort of distancing also is experienced as object loss. Uh, and uh, Then we have object damage. If something happens to the object, then that also is felt as though you are losing the object. So object damage in whatever way also can trigger the same kind of difficulties as an object loss can, and therefore we put it on the same spectrum of object loss. So when we say object loss being responsible for pathology, all these events on this continuum, on this spectrum, can be at play. And
Can I ask a question?
yeah, please. Yes, please.
Yeah, in your object relations, if the object is being traumatic for you or causing you trauma or harm, can that also become pathological and because of the object loss phenomenon, or is it something else?
Yeah, so that is where we realize that object loss is not the only thing responsible for pathology. Right? It can also be because of bad object. That there is no object loss, but the presence of the object is pathological. And this brings us to the orientation to objects. The most common and logical orientation is a good object is better than no object is better than a bad object. But many people interchange the second and the third, and their minds process it this way: a good object is better than a bad object is better than a no object. For many people, a bad object is better than no object. The terror of abandonment is so high that they would rather have a bad object than not to have an object. And this creates a problem because then you are stuck in that situation, that there is no way but to suffer the badness of the bad object because you are not ready to practice the alternative. So this is the entire thing about object loss, and a majority of sicknesses in DSM and in psychoanalysis, whatever way you look, can be attributed to object loss directly or indirectly, maybe once as a one-time event or an event that happens in series. And uh, very few schools take it so seriously as the concept merits itself to be taken, except the Kleinian school in psychoanalysis. Supriya, you are on mute. Yeah.
Do you think object loss is central to many pathological conditions?
Yes, it is. Um, Take depressive disorders, anxiety disorders, addiction disorders, and personality disorders. Definitely in these four categories, and these categories constitute a major part of our practice. Any country in the world. You can also add to it sexual disorders. So when you look at these five categories of disorders, often we realize that when we go deep enough, we get into the Oedipal problem. First, we get into the over the time problem, which has built up over the years. When we go deeper, we get into the Oedipal issues, and we go still deeper into the pre-Oedipal pathology. We get into the object loss issues. So I would believe personally, and many other people also believe, particularly Kleinians, that experience of a good, reliable, stable object, experience of a good, reliable, stable object early in life is central to our physical and mental health. And one of the core necessities for good psychological and physical health is internalization of a good, reliable, stable object. And object loss does exactly opposite of it. It does not allow you to internalize a good, reliable, stable object, rather creates a traumatic situation because of object loss. So this is not the only explanation of the five categories that I have listed out, but this is what many people in psychoanalysis believe, and I personally agree with that. That object loss is central to these five categories of sicknesses. Not all of them listed in these five categories, but almost 60 to 70%. And in fact, I have created a Valley Junction model which is based upon object loss and as the central event for explaining all the personality disorders.
Uh, how do pre and post object loss events bear upon the person?
This is very important, and this is a question people usually don't ask. Even the Kleinians who place so much of significance on object loss, even they don't ask usually these questions. Few of them do. That it is not only the object loss which is important, but there are other issues which are important along with the object loss. First, when did the object loss happen? The earlier it happens, the worse it is. Second, how intense and sudden was the object loss? The more intense and sudden it is, the worse it is. Third is, what was the experience of the child before the object loss took place? This is very important. If the object loss takes place at a time where the child has not experienced anything good, without a experience of a good object, if the object loss takes place, then the pathology development is very severe. An extremely fragile character structure, extremely fragile ego, and then we are looking at the psychotic spectrum or something near to the psychotic spectrum. So we are looking at something severe on the psychotic spectrum, near to psychotic spectrum, or something that will involve a the complete split, like in case of multiple personality disorders or something of that sort. However, if we have good experience before the object loss happens, then that good experience lays a good foundation. And even though the object loss may be sudden, deep, and the constitution may be hypersensitive, and the ego strength may be low, even then, the worst does not come true. You stop at personality disorders, or you stop at somatization, or you stop at something neurotic. You don't go to the depth of something psychotic or a multiple personality. So this is very important. What happens, what type of experience you have before the object loss happens. And similarly, equally important is what happens after the object loss event. Over the time, do parents and elders and others around, maybe in school, neighborhood and home, do they give experiences which counteract the effects of the object loss event, or do they add to the stress which is already there? If you have good enough parenting, good enough schooling and good enough neighborhood experiences, then the difficulties of the traumatic event can be lessened. So the pre-events and the post-events, they both have a very important role in determining the intensity of effect of the traumatic event of object loss. In the very unfortunate situation, if the pre-situation is bad and the post-situation also is bad, we have the worst possible outcomes. In many cases, we see the pre-situation is good, but the post-situation is not good. So the behavior of the parents actually adds to the early life event of object loss instead of undoing it. And that sort of creates a chronic pathology. So when we look at somatization, when we look at personality disorders, these are usually the cases where pre-object loss events, there were good experiences, but post-object loss events, there were not good experiences. So the pre and post of the traumatic event of object loss is as important as the traumatic event of object loss itself in determining what pathology takes place in the mind.
Is there any other dimension to object loss? I mean, something like freedom from objects.
Um, from a Freudian point of view and from a spiritual point of view, yes. From a strictly Kleinian point of view, and that part of psychoanalysis which is based on the current empirical infant research, the answer would be no, because most of the Kleinian analysts and many of the child research professionals, they have come to conclusion recently that our psychic life essentially is object related life even early in our years, and therefore we don't have actually an object free psychic state. We don't have anything like pure eros or pure thanatos. But I look at it differently. I am more in agreement with Freud that there is a possibility of an object free psychological state, and that object free psychological state uh, can happen in very early life, what Freud calls the state of primary narcissism, the oceanic feeling of primary narcissism. It can also happen in supranormal spiritual states, and we have very adequate and elaborate description of that state experienced by not one or two but hundreds of people, at least in India. And I had the fortune of meeting a few people who were experiencing that, and I could see them and I could talk to them, and they verified that such states are possible. So from a purely Kleinian and contemporary infant research point of view, it is not possible to have an object free state of mind. But from a Freudian point of view, spiritual point of view, and in my own personal opinion, I think it is possible to have object free state. Not only that, but to experience eros and thanatos, right? Not in their full blown 100% intensity, but very near to it, say 70-75% of their intensity, even without involving object in the psychological process. It is like saying, for example, can you experience envy without feeling envy towards an object? Can you experience pure envy into itself? And basis of my own personal experience, I can say that it is possible to experience envy into itself without involving any object. And that I think is true for all affects, that if we have the capability of going inside and clearing up ourselves, working on ourselves, it's possible to get to a situation to experience pure affect, all pure affects in their pure form without objects, and also to experience object free states of mind.
That's very interesting. So I think our journey as an infant begin with object relations and object gains and whatever. As we develop, as you said, there is a possibility of being free from that object relations or object going into an object free state. At
Yeah.
least spiritually, that is definitely possible.
Yes.
Okay, now the next question is, can object loss be profitable?
Uh, yes. You can have a profit in loss. It depends on what you are losing. Right? So it is not true that object loss always is a loss. It depends upon what is the object we are discussing in question. As a child, regardless of how parents are, because survival is at stake, regardless of what parents are, how they are, their loss is felt as object loss and traumatic. But as we grow up, we experience it differently. And we all want, as adults, freedom from bad objects. In fact, with relation to many people, we actually pray to God that we should experience an object loss and be free from that torture. And that's how divorces happen, breakup happen, separations happen. That people are tired of objects and they want freedom from those objects. So they pray day and night to have object loss because there's profit in that object loss. So it is not necessary that every object loss is traumatic. Object losses can be profitable, they can be traumatic. In early childhood, it is more likely to be traumatic. But if the parents are very bad, then in many cases, even in childhood, an object loss would be better than a traumatic object presence.
Also, like pertaining to this question, this can object loss be profitable? Can it be also profitable in helping one move faster in the spiritual progress direction?
Yes, it can be. In fact, that is what is prescribed in many religions, that don't get entangled with objects. And one of the prescriptions on the spiritual path is to have optimum object engagement and not to have too much object engagement, and to break free from the entanglement of objects. So,
So getting away from objects and also object loss just as a part of the process
yeah,
or
this,
progress into your spiritual thing.
yeah, the goal there is of freedom from object dependence,
Right.
so that when we let go of objects, it does not feel like a loss.
Yes.
We feel when we move away from an object, we feel the loss and the trauma because of desire and dependence. If desire and dependence are worked upon, right, and automatically the need for the other goes, the moving away of the other does not result in loss. In fact, it results more in peace and freedom,
Right.
because you don't want to bother yourself with the hassle of the other.
Right.
And there is also too much of a strong inward call to focus all your energy, time, and attention inside to attend to some phenomena which are important from a spiritual or self-development point of view.
Yes, very true. One more thing about object loss being profitable. I mean, can you say that it is related to creativity?
Yes, in two ways. One is, if you experience object loss, then there is a desperate search for an object in many people, not all people, but in many people. And that desperate search for an object can concretely happen in the real world or can happen in the psychological world of imagination and creativity by creating good objects. So you create good objects, and that creating of good objects can lead you to creation of very good pieces of art and literature. That because you have suffered an object loss, you want to create good objects, and you create good objects in art. So that is one area where it leads to creativity. Or second area can be that in your anger, in imagination, you have damaged an object in early life, and as a part of the reparative process, you want to make good and recreate the damaged object as it was before you attacked it. And that act of reparation can also lead to creativity. So a desperate search for an object or a repetitive act to restore the object, both of them can be at the root of very intense and strong creativity in the artistic area, so also in the scientific area.
And also channelizing one's emotions after the object loss through art, or expressing them through art.
Yes, yes, yes. It's a good way of uh, dealing with one's object loss. But this is relatively a high functioning person. When I mean, we would call it mild to moderate situation. If it's severe situation or moderate to severe situation, the person may not be as high functioning to really be able to use art to engage with the object loss.
Right. Can we talk about some works of arts related to object loss?
Two come to my mind, I can cite right away. One is the novel Great Expectations by Charles Dickens. In that novel, there is a character, one of the central characters, Miss Havisham, who has suffered an object loss, abandoned by her lover, and she goes into a depressed life and lives all alone in that almost haunted castle kind of house, and wants to take revenge from man for what has happened to her. So she has all the pent up anger towards men, and she wants to take revenge vicariously. And that is how she brings up the beautiful girl Stella, and through her takes revenge on that central character of that novel, the young man. So this is one outcome of how she deals with object loss. She responds to intense object loss with a lifelong depression, anger, and revenge. The second example is in Alfred Hitchcock movie called Psycho. There are three versions of the movie: 1, 2, and 3. Psycho 1, Psycho 2, Psycho 3. And in that, the person reacts to object loss of his mother in a very different way. He can't suffer it, he can't deal with it, so he has to deny the object loss, and he denies the object loss by keeping the dead body well maintained and not disposing of the dead body into the graveyard or the crematorium. So the person maintains the body of the mother because he can't deal with the separation from the mother, the object loss. So he deals with object loss by denial, and he deals with object loss by regression, going into early life split fantasies and early life extremely aggressive and persecutory fantasies, and ends up killing people. So these are two examples of how people have been shown in works of art to deal so differently with object loss, very intense object loss.
Freud talks about the juice of melancholia. And in our Indian aesthetic systems, also there is something called the Karuna Ras. So
Uh,
is it also related to object loss?
Many times it is. In fact, mostly it is that uh, the Karun Ras, or as Freud would call it, melancholia, the juice of melancholia rather, is related to object loss. Not always, but most of the times. And it's interesting to look at a few issues on this point. The first is, for Freud, the pleasure principle almost seems absolute, and the juice of melancholia seemed almost pathological, a masochistic enterprise. Till very late in life, when he started looking at the death instinct and uh, the unconscious painful pleasure, and that got him into difficulties of defining pleasure per se. So for Freud, for most of his life, uh, maximization of pleasure and minimization of pain was normal, and relishing of pain was pathological, masochistic, till almost the later part of his life when he started seeing it otherwise. But he did start seeing it otherwise towards the end, where he looked at melancholia as an outcome of death instinct, which was as fundamental as the life instinct, which indirectly meant that the pleasure drive had a comparable component with the pain drive. Although he never said it in these words, this is what it meant, that there is a death instinct, and by death instinct, if the outcomes of death instinct also are secretly enjoyable, then it means pain also is enjoyable. And just as you have a pleasure drive, you also have a pain drive, a, a very special kind of pain drive which is secretly pleasurable. And this is different from the pain which happens with the frustration of the pleasure drive. But these are the areas which he could not completely finely demarcate and elaborate. However, in the Indian side, it was always clear that the Indian aesthetics looked at pain much like the Greek civilization looked at it. It was a part of natural part of aesthetics and nothing pathological about it. Relishing of pain or feeling light after feeling pain. This was the very much the soul of the Greek drama and art, catharsis. And in the Indian system also, the rasa system, the karun ras or the juice of melancholy is among one of the flavors of feelings. It is not relegated to something pathological. It is as natural as ordinary pleasure. So is something which is called uh, bibhats, something which is distasteful, repulsive, horrifying, and almost torturous. It's difficult to translate, but this is where it comes to. But even that has been described as a rasa, as a juice. Most of us can abhor that juice, think of it as uncivilized and psychotic, but in the aesthetic system, it is still kept as a juice for those who relish it and for those who can handle it. So this is how the two systems are very different, and we find the Indian system very close to the Greek and far more open and accepting of the the juice of melancholia, the karun rus, which often happens because of object loss.
In spiritual terms, how do we look at the beginning and the purpose of object loss?
Uh, in spiritual terms, this is looked at in very different ways. First, in terms of the purpose of it, that why did you have such a constitution that you experienced object loss early in life? Or why did you have such a constitution and some events in environment which together created the trauma of object loss? Spirituality does not believe that it is just an accident. So spirituality gets into the purpose of pathology, especially chronic pathology. It believes that there is a purpose behind it, partly a karmic purpose to pay off the rent, and partly the journey of life, that had this pathology not happened, many of the things you achieved in life, because of being confined by pathology to certain areas, that kind of focus and achievement would not have been there, and you may have lived a happy-go-lucky life but not developed in psychological and spiritual sense the way you have. So this is one way of looking at the purpose of pathology in general and purpose of object loss in particular. It can also be looked at in a karmic way, that because you did somebody experience object loss, now you are experiencing it. Secondly, after the origin part of it, it comes to what to do with it. And spirituality goes into how to manage this object loss and not be object dependent. Because the normalcy standards are you should be in relationship with adequate number of objects. That is normal. And that is necessary for health. But spirituality talks about being free from object dependence. And that means that somehow objects are so well internalized, what Kohut calls transmuting internalization. And Klein calls internalization of a good, reliable, stable object. That has happened so well that the internal object situation is so good that even if you don't have objects around, you don't get into a traumatic situation of object vacuum or object loss. So the second part is the goal. And the third part, very importantly, is in many spiritual practices, as you go deeper, particularly in some Buddhist practices, you actually uh, are made to go through a process where most of the time you are alone, and that makes you go through very early life situations of object loss, abandonment, and inner disintegration. You actually consciously experience the inner disintegration before the Rith synthesis happens. And therefore, object loss, disintegration, abandonment, annihilation, anxiety, these are taken to be parts of the process rather than something pathological to be avoided from a distance. And lastly, it has its own basket full of tools and approaches to deal with the situation, to help somebody quickly heal and come out of the situation free.
Is it true that the object world is between two extremes of Eros and Thanatos?
Yes, it is true. Uh, Many people believe there's nothing like pure Eros and pure Thanatos. It's always bound up with objects. But I have personally experienced some pure affects, and many others have also reported it. Freud also talks about primary narcissism and object free state. Spirituality also talks about object free states in various forms. The Buddhists talk about object free state in a very different way than the followers of Vedanta do. But both of them are referring to different forms of object free states: the state of nothingness of nirvana and the state of universal oneness of the Vedantic type, Vedantic approach. So spirituality talks about existence of object free states and experience of pure eros or pure thanatos or something even beyond it. Freud talks of primary narcissism. I have personally experienced some pure affects, and therefore I do believe that it's possible to experience pure affects, and maybe not 100% pure eros and 100% pure thanatos, but something like 70% of them without involving any object. So that is a possibility to experience, and I think if we explore more, we'll understand that part much better.
I believe it requires very regular and deep spiritual practices and all
Yes,
to
yes,
experience pure affect.
and quite a bit of luck,
Oh, yes, of course.
because you can't will these states to appear.
True. And some guidance of some person who is himself or herself gone through such experiences
True,
also.
true.
Can we manage our object world better? I mean, our object relations in some way?
Of course, we can, and this is what I think we are all trying to do without using the word object relations. We are trying to do it all the time, and there are three or four elements that we can always do. One is to go through the process of mourning, analysis, uh, understanding, and setting right whatever has happened because of object loss in the past. So, healing of past object loss is one. Second is to address the schema or those templates in us which make recurrent object losses come true. Third is to reduce and eliminate, if possible, dependence on bad objects. Fourth is to know what is compatibility for us and go for compatible good objects. And fifth is to go in for a right amount of quality and quantity, because that's always the trade-off. And as we age, we realize quality is better than quantity. Of course, we need a critical quantity, but above that, it's the quality that matters. And these five, I think, are very important elements. Some of them can be done in therapy, some of them by our own practice, and some of them might require spiritual guidance or some holistic healing guidance. But consciously, if we put our mind to it and we work upon it, and I think we should work upon it, it's a very important element of our quality of life.
Right. So when you're talking about managing our object world better in terms of managing our object relations better, is it the same thing as maintenance of the object relations which you mentioned at the beginning of our
That's,
discussion?
that's one part of it, right? Because
Can you elaborate a bit? I
uh,
mean, maintenance of object relations and managing the object relations in an optimal zone.
uh, see, managing object relations means one, looking at the past losses, overcoming them; two, looking at what kind of objects you want to deal with and not deal with. And once you start dealing with some objects and you find difficulties, and you have to take a call whether to let go or whether to continue. Once you decide to continue, then the maintenance part comes in. Because if something is not naturally compatible but you wish to maintain, then the whole maintenance part comes in. If something is naturally compatible, you don't have to consciously do it, the maintenance happens on its own. But the way it is structured in Asian societies, where a lot of things are family driven or society driven, we always don't find people in these countries in compatible situations. They find themselves with people with whom there is less compatibility, but they are together because of social reasons, economic reasons, and all sorts of reasons. And there the whole maintenance part comes in, and there one has to figure out what to do, how much to give in, how much to draw the boundary, what to do, what not to do. And that's a question of specifics given the situation of the person and who is on the opposite side. And it can also involve uh, certain meditative practices. And what I always say, the third space, always go for 1 hour every day to a space where people from home and office are not there. You meet a third group of people, and that's very, very necessary, because we all need a break from each other every day.
Right. Okay.
On a
Uh,
continuous basis, we are all too much for each other.
how does enlightenment or deep spiritual experience transform our relationship aspect?
It creates a freedom from object dependence to a great extent. It creates what Gohut would call a transmuting internalization. It significantly alters our desire and fear structure, which is at the root of our desire for object gain and object loss trauma. So, the very reasons why object loss is so traumatic, those reasons themselves are cut by half. Uh, it also, enlightenment also gets into this state of object free existence, freedom from dependence, and often doing something good for others, and therefore the object relations becomes very altruistic. So one, it is minimized, and second, it becomes altruistic, and third, there is a freedom from dependence on objects. And these are some of the very important elements of an enlightened person, how he negotiates through object relations without expectations from the other, which is a very different way of relating compared to the normal way that we relate to.
Does holistic healing help in our object relationship aspects?
Yes, both holistic healing and spirituality have something to offer. Uh, so, if we look at object loss aspect, the first aspect is to heal the trauma of the past. On that account, holistic healing in the form of homeopathy, Reiki, pranic healing, and many other practices, some yogic practices, they have the potential to offer us some form of healing. The second aspect involves creation of good objects inside or internalizing good objects from outside. The spiritual situation of the guru or the idol, particularly if idol worship is used or some form is used for doing some spiritual practices, those forms they become omnipotent, good, reliable, stable objects in many cases. The gods become good, reliable, stable objects. The guru becomes one, or somebody else becomes one, and internalization gets one more chance. This process of internalizing good, reliable, stable objects. Then you also have spiritual and occult practices, be it the practice of avishkar or be it the practice of mantra or visualization or certain rituals or certain herbal preparations or certain shamanic situations or processes. All of them have something to offer to address this issue of object loss, object gain, object maintenance, and in general, freedom from objects. On all these accounts, they have something to offer.
Also, like holistic healing practices like say Reiki, pranic healing, yogic exercises. If they are done regularly, then possibly, as you said in the earlier part, that the desire and fear aspects themselves are more under control and better managed.
True, very true. If you can make, particularly pranic healing, if you can make it an everyday practice, it is a very good support uh, to help you whatever the pathology be. It may help differently. In some cases, it may help by 10%, in some cases 50%, in some cases 80%, but it's definitely a great help. And on a regular basis, it acts even more powerfully, much better, much higher efficacy. And there's one more element of getting into these groups, these spiritual and holistic healing groups. They also provide us with a very positive environment and many good objects to internalize. So, and this whole meditative practices, they get you back into that state of reverie and the state of peace and bliss. So these are some add-ons which happen, which normally we don't notice, but they have quite a role to play in that healing process.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Vaidya, for
Uh,
this
just,
very
one,
insightful.
just one more point. I think there is a something comes to my mind, and I would like to share it. Something on this, on uh, how various schools look at object loss. Because this just came to my mind that different schools look at object loss in very different ways, because this phenomena is universally there, whether we acknowledge it or we don't acknowledge it.
Yes.
So how do various schools look at it? It's very important to know that. Let us say somebody comes with addiction and the root of addiction is in object loss, and let us say the person goes to a CBT person. Now the CBT person will consider the traumatic event of object loss, but he will not use the word object loss or go into object loss the way a Kleinian will go or a psychoanalytic person will go. So he will go into the thought part of the event. So with regard to the traumatic event, there is a thought part into which you can go. There is an affect part into which you can go. There is an energy part into which you can go. there can be just a cathartic part into which you can go. And in the event, you may like to focus on object loss, or you may just look at the whole event as a traumatic event and focus either only on the thought part, emotion part, energy part, and so on. So different schools look at it differently. The cognitively oriented schools, they will look at the object loss event in terms of what thoughts were generated when that event happened,
Right.
how those templates are still affecting him. On the other extreme, those who are into emotion centered therapy or something very affectively driven, they will look only at the affect part of it, what feelings were generated, not so much on what thoughts were generated. Some who are more concerned with ego work will look at what defenses were used and what templates were created. Some like ISTDP will just go into the catharsis part, that whatever feelings were created, can that be felt and catharted out. And some like psychoanalysis will be in between. They will focus on both, making the unconscious thoughts conscious and allowing the feelings to come up and be released in catharsis. So, different schools in psychotherapy, they treat object loss with different degrees of significance. Some don't even use the word or even focus on the concept, and some, like Kleinian psychoanalysis, would heavily focus on the concept. In my opinion, I think we are doing a great, rather, we are committing a mistake by not recognizing such an important phenomena of object loss, which is so central, and looking at only the thought or emotion aspect of it and not looking at all the aspects of it. And this is true not only for CBT, DBT, REBT, which are more cognitively driven, but even within psychoanalysis, uh, except for the Kleinian school, very few schools actually look at the, or rather appreciate the significance of object loss. Take, for example, the Freudian school and the Oedipus. The Freudian school looks at the Oedipus primarily as a drive frustration phenomena and a castration anxiety phenomena with some amount of guilt coming in. But the same phenomena of Oedipus is also an object loss phenomena. And similarly, in very early life, the feeling of attachment, abandonment, all of them involve object losses. Object losses also involve imaginary objects we have created in our minds. They also involve imaginary desires we have by virtue of our constitution, which are not in congruence with what the outer objects are or can be. So this is a very deep concept and a very important concept in the psychic life and pathology both, also in healing. And I hope that, or rather I wish that this becomes central in all the schools, regardless of how they are approaching pathology and healing.
And even in our, I think in our previous video also we mentioned this, and that object loss phenomenon is happening in our day-to-day life also. It's not just when you talk of the pathology or
Yes,
the therapy aspect,
yes.
but our day-to-day living also is like involving object gain, object maintenance, object loss on a very daily basis.
Yeah, it's a very dynamic, unending, ceaseless situation.
Yes. So if there is some discourse and some awareness in this area, even for a common person without having any pathological issues,
Right.
it can help in lot of ways to manage it better.
Yeah, yeah. I think it's a very important element for quality of life, even for a healthy person.
Right. So that's why possibly regular holistic healing practices, spiritual practices, exercise, and all these things possibly create that base to manage your object world better. Possibly that's what I feel
So,
for a normal person. I mean, not having pathological issues.
in a crude industrial terminology, it is inventory management of objects.
Yes. Right.
One way to look at it is to make a list of our object losses and a list of our object desires. And that itself is a great insight provider.
Yes. Absolutely. Okay, thank you so much, Mr. Vaidya, for this very insightful and engaging discussion.
Thank you.
And we shall continue more such discussions on this topic. We can go deeper and deeper into this, I'm sure.
Sure, we can. We can.
Yeah. Uh, Meanwhile, do write to us at hvindia@gmail.com. Namaste.
Namaste.